My fiancé's mother blocked my 6-year-old from Christmas dinner and told her to wait outside in the snow, while her grandchildren ran inside with gift bags. So I handed her one quiet envelope and smiled. The porch light burned orange over Diane's shoulder as she blocked the doorway with one arm. Your daughter can wait outside. This dinner is for our kids. Nora's small hand tightened around mine. She was 6, wearing the red dress she'd picked out herself, holding a tin of cookies she'd frosted at my kitchen counter that afternoon. Snow fell sideways under the porch light. It caught in her hair and melted before it landed. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I smiled and said, okay. Then I reached into my coat and pulled out a plain white envelope. This is for you, Diane. Open it later. She blinked, confused, and took it anyway. Old habits. Diane always took what people handed her. I turned around. I took Nora's hand. We walked back down the long, icy driveway while the party glowed gold behind us, laughter spilling through the windows like nothing had happened. Inside, I could hear Levi and Josie shrieking over their gift bags. 8 kids' voices, weaving through Winter Wonderland on the stereo. My daughter's cookie tin sat forgotten on the porch railing where I'd set it down, stickers pressed carefully onto the lid. Nora didn't cry until we reached the car. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading for 6 months. Why doesn't Grandma Diane like me? I buckled her into her booster seat and told her the only true thing I had. She doesn't know you very well yet, baby. That's not your fault. That's hers. I started the engine. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else that happened that night, because 6 months earlier, none of this would have made sense to me at all. I'm a paralegal. I read contracts for a living at Kessler and Voss, a real estate firm off Far Hills Avenue in Dayton. I noticed the clause nobody else reads. It's not a talent. It's a habit built from watching people sign away things they didn't understand. Grant was different from anyone I'd dated. He was patient in a way that felt earned, not performed. Steady. He fixed my wobbly kitchen table on our 3rd date, unasked, because he noticed it rocked when I set down my coffee. He kept a dinosaur drawing Nora made him tucked behind his truck's sun visor for months, and I only found out because it fell out when he hit a pothole on Woodman Drive. We met at a coffee shop in Oakwood called The Mill, 2 years before that Christmas Eve. He was 32 then, working as a project manager for a HVAC contractor. I was 28, a single mother, and cautious in the specific way you get after one man already leaves. Nora's father, Colin, left when she was 2. He sends child support when he remembers to. He calls on her birthday most years. I stopped waiting for him to be more than that a long time ago, and I built a life that didn't need him to be. Grant never once made me feel like Nora was a package deal he was tolerating. He learned her favorite dinosaur was the Parasaurolophus, not the T-Rex, and corrected people who got it wrong. He came to her kindergarten graduation and cried a little, which he denied later, badly. We got engaged in April, 8 months before that Christmas Eve, at the Overlook off John Bryan State Park. Nora was there. Grant had asked her permission first, privately, the week before. She told me later that she'd said yes on my behalf before he even asked me. I thought I understood what I was marrying into. Diane was 61, widowed for 3 years. Grant's father, Walter, had a heart attack in the garage of the house on Denlinger Road, the same house Diane still lived in, the house with the wallpaper Walter never got around to stripping. Grant talked about his father rarely, and always carefully, like the memory had sharp edges he didn't want to catch on. The one story he did tell, more than once, was about a fishing cabin near Indian Lake that Walter used to rent every July for a week, just him and Grant, a tradition that started when Grant was 9 and continued until he left for college. Diane never came. She told people for years that she didn't care for the outdoors, though Grant told me once, almost as an aside, that he'd overheard his parents arguing about the cabin the summer he turned 14, his mother saying she didn't see the point in spending money on a week that didn't include her, his father saying quietly that some things belonged to just the 2 of them, and that was allowed. I didn't think much of that story at the time. I think about it differently now, the way you reread an old letter once you know how the story ends. Walter had understood something about his wife early on, some instinct about what she did with the parts of a family she felt excluded from, and he'd built a small, stubborn exception into his marriage to protect one relationship from it. I wonder sometimes whether Renee's mother ever got a version of that same protection, or whether Walter's daughter from his first marriage had simply been the practice round before he learned to draw a line at all. After Walter died, Diane leaned on Grant. That seemed normal to me at first. Grief does that. She called him for everything. A leaking faucet, a car that wouldn't start, a form she didn't understand from the county. He drove out to Kettering most Sundays to help her with something, and I never once resented it. I liked that about him. What I didn't know yet was that Diane owned a second property, a 4-plex on Denlinger Road 2 blocks from her own house, an inheritance from her own mother. She'd been renting the units out for 11 years, badly, informally, in cash when she could get it, and in excuses when she couldn't. By that May, the 4-plex was collapsing under her. Back taxes had piled up to $14,200. A second mortgage she'd taken out after Walter died sat at $61,400, payments long behind. A contractor named Ross Denny had filed a lien for $9,800 after Diane refused to pay him for a roof he'd already finished, claiming the work was shoddy when really she just didn't have the money. The county was 14 days from a tax sale notice when Grant finally told me the full number. She needs someone to co-sign a refinance, he said, sitting on the edge of my bed while Nora watched cartoons downstairs. $86,000 all rolled together. Her credit's wrecked. She can't get approved alone. And you can't can't co-sign, I said. It wasn't a question. I already knew his credit had taken a hit 2 years earlier, a medical bill from an ER visit that went to collections before he even saw the paperwork. No, he said, I can't. He didn't ask me directly. He didn't have to. The silence did it for him, the way silences do in relationships where you already know what's being requested. I said yes, but I did it my way. I drafted the paperwork myself instead of letting the lender's boilerplate stand as written. I built in a release clause, paragraph 14, that let me exit the loan entirely once Diane could refinance again on her own credit, once enough equity had built that a lender would take her without a cosigner. It was a habit, not a suspicion. I build exit clauses into everything. Owen, the attorney I worked under, used to joke that I drafted my grocery lists with contingencies. Diane signed without asking what paragraph 14 meant. She signed without reading past the signature line, the way she signed most things. I remember thinking at the time that it should have worried me more than it did. There was an earlier incident that spring I didn't understand until much later. In March, before any of the loan trouble surfaced, Diane hosted a small dinner for Grant's birthday. Nora had made him a card, a purple triceratops with Grant written in glitter glue. Diane picked it up off the table, glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds, and set it face down under a serving dish without a word. I noticed. Grant didn't. Nora didn't seem to, or if she did, she didn't say so. I told myself it meant nothing. Diane was from a generation that didn't fuss over children's crafts. I filed it away and didn't look at it again for months. The refinance closed on May 28th. $86,000, my name on the note alongside Diane's, my credit carrying weight, hers couldn't. The monthly payment came to $612. Then the payments started slipping. Late in June, partial in August, missing entirely in October. Grant made excuses for her every time, the same shape of excuse wearing different clothes. She's between renters. She's waiting on a check from Hal. She just needs one more week. I covered the gaps every single month out of my own account without telling anyone I was doing it. By November, I'd quietly paid $2,448 that was never mine to owe. I kept a folder on my laptop labeled House, which was a lie of a name because it had nothing to do with any house I lived in. Dates, screenshots, every missed payment, every partial one, labeled and time-stamped the way I'd label evidence for a client file at work. I didn't tell Grant I was keeping it. I told myself it was just how my brain worked. Paralegals build files. That's what we do. And while my money quietly held her house together, Diane started erasing my daughter. It began small enough that I second-guessed myself for weeks. At a Sunday dinner in July, Diane set the table with 8 plates for 8 guests, and mine came out on a folded paper towel instead, balanced on my lap because there wasn't a 9th chair. Nora didn't get a plate at all. She ate off the edge of mine, cross-legged on the living room floor, while Levi and Josie sat at the table with their own place settings and cartoon napkins. I mentioned it to Grant in the car on the way home. She just wasn't thinking, he said. She's got a lot going on with the house right now. I let it go. I told myself the same thing. In September, the family Christmas card photo got scheduled early, the way Diane always did it, at a studio in Beaver Creek 2 months before Christmas, so she could mail them out by Thanksgiving. I brought Nora in her nicest dress. Diane looked at the photographer's arrangement chart, looked at Nora, and said, "Let's keep it to grandkids and immediate family this round. We'll do a bigger one next year." Grant stood right there. He didn't say anything. Nora sat in a folding chair against the studio wall for 40 minutes, swinging her feet, while 8 children who all shared Diane's blood got arranged into 3 rows and smiled for a camera. I didn't say anything either that day. I've turned that over more times than I can count since. I told myself I was choosing my battles. I was choosing them into silence, and Diane was counting everyone I let go. October brought Hal's birthday, a backyard party at his place in Centerville, with a bounce house and a sheet cake from Kroger. Diane cut the cake herself, the way she always did at family events, like it was a duty she'd assigned to herself and no one else was permitted to share. 2 slices for Levi, 2 for Josie. She wrapped the rest in foil and carried it toward her car before Nora's plate had even been mentioned. Nora just watched her go. She was 5 months from turning 7, old enough to do the math on being forgotten, too young to say so out loud. She didn't ask why. I cut my own slice in half with a plastic fork and slid it across the picnic table without a word, and she ate it slowly, the way kids eat when they're trying not to seem like they noticed anything. Nora's own birthday landed 9 days later, on the 4th of August, and I'd sent Diane a calendar invite for it back in June, the way I did every year, along with a group text reminder the week before. Diane didn't come. She sent Grant a card for Nora 2 days late, unsigned except for a printed "Love Grandma" on the inside flap, the kind you buy in a 6-pack at the drugstore without picking a specific one out. There was no gift inside it, not even the $5 bill she tucked into Levi's and Josie's cards every year without fail. "She's been slammed with the contractor stuff," Grant said when I mentioned it, and I let that explanation sit in the car between us the way I'd let every other one sit there since March, unchallenged, filed away instead of spoken aloud. Nora didn't ask about the missing gift. She'd already stopped expecting one by then, which worried me more than any single snub had on its own. A 6-year-old shouldn't have to develop that kind of foresight about who's going to disappoint her and by how much. I finally said something to Grant the night of Hal's party, in the driveway of his mother's house after we'd dropped off the leftover balloons. "She left without giving Nora cake. She probably just forgot with everything going on," he said. "I'll talk to her." He didn't talk to her. Or he did, and it didn't take. I never found out which, because 2 weeks later, at a family text thread about a Labor Day trip that had gotten rescheduled to a long weekend in November, Diane wrote that the lake lake house in Yellow Springs only slept 8, and the 8 were already spoken for. Grant, his sister Ren, and her husband, Hal, and his family, Diane herself. There was no seat in the math for me or Nora. Grant asked if we could bring an air mattress. Diane said the septic system couldn't handle more people than it was built for. I didn't push. I told myself I didn't need a seat at every table. I told myself Nora was young enough not to remember most of this, which was the kind of lie you tell yourself when you're more tired than you're willing to admit. What I did instead was start paying closer attention. I noticed that Diane and Ren had started a habit of angling their phones away from me when I walked into a room. A small motion, barely anything, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't already looking for patterns. I noticed Diane had stopped inviting Nora and me to the same events she invited Levi and Josie's mother to, a rotating set of excuses that all pointed the same direction. In late November, at what should have been an unremarkable Sunday dinner, Diane brought up the loan for the first time in months, in front of everyone, at the table, over pot roast. I know things have been tight, she said, looking at me, not at Grant. I appreciate you helping with the house. I hope you know how much that means to this family. It sounded like gratitude. It wasn't. I'd read enough contracts to recognize the shape of a sentence doing 2 jobs at once. She was reminding me what I owed her, and she was doing it in front of witnesses, so that if I ever brought up how she'd treated Nora, there would already be a story on record about how grateful I should have been instead. Family helps family, Grant said, squeezing my hand under the table. And I understood in that moment that he believed both things could be true simultaneously, that his mother could be struggling and difficult at the same time, and that I was supposed to hold both without complaint because that's what love in his family looked like. I smiled at Diane across the pot roast. Of course, I said. She smiled back, and for a second I thought I saw something pass behind her eyes, some calculation resolving itself, though I couldn't have told you what it was. December started with wedding planning. Grant and I hadn't set a date yet, though we'd been engaged 8 months, and every time I brought it up, he found a reason to table it. Once his mother's house was steady, once the holidays were behind them, once things settled down. I started to notice that settled down never had an edge to it. It kept sliding forward, always another month out, always tied somehow to Diane. On December 9th, I was standing in Grant's kitchen waiting for him to finish a work call when his phone lit up on the counter beside me, face up, a notification banner sliding down from the top, a family group thread. Diane's name at the top of the preview. I only caught a fragment before the screen dimmed again. Something about gift bags, something about the grandkids. I didn't open it. It wasn't my phone. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I'd told myself everything else was nothing since March, but I didn't forget it either. I've never been good at forgetting things that itch. 2 days later, Ren called me directly, which she almost never did. She asked, careful and a little too casual, whether Nora had a preference between 2 sizes of snow boots, since she was trying to get everyone's gift bags sorted before Christmas Eve. It was a kind thing to ask. It also told me Nora was, at least in Ren's mind, one of the kids getting a bag. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt a low static hum of wrongness I couldn't name yet. Grant and I had a fight that week, our first real one in months. Not about his mother directly, but about the wedding date, which was really the same fight wearing a different coat. I told him I needed a month, an actual month, something I could put on a calendar and show Nora. Once the house stuff with Mom is settled, he said, we'll pick a date, I promise. You keep saying that like it's a finish line, I said. What does settled even mean to you? He didn't have an answer. I don't think he'd ever let himself ask the question directly enough to find one. Diane called me directly on December 14th, which she almost never did. She usually routed everything through Grant, like I was a department she didn't have the clearance to contact without him as a supervisor. I wanted to check in, she said, her voice pitched soft, the voice she used when she wanted something to sound like concern instead of a request. This time of year is so hard on my blood pressure. Dr. Feldman says stress is the worst thing for a woman my age. I just hope we're all still on the same page about the house, about everything. We are, I said, because I genuinely didn't know yet how untrue that was about to become. I just worry sometimes, she went on, about what happens if things don't work out. Between you and Grant, I mean. I'd hate for the loan to get complicated over something like that. I sat with that sentence for a long moment after we hung up. I read contracts for a living. I know a conditional clause when I hear one, even spoken aloud, even wrapped in the softest voice a person can manage. She wasn't asking about my relationship with her son out of love. She was asking because my name sat next to hers on $86,000, and she wanted to know how stable that arrangement was going to stay. 2 days before Christmas Eve, I drove to Grant's apartment to drop off a gift for his sister. He was in the shower when I let myself in with my key. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, screen lit from an incoming notification, the same group thread lighting up again. I told myself one more time that it wasn't my business. Then I saw my daughter's name in the preview line, and every rule I'd set for myself about other people's phones stopped mattering. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I picked up the phone. Ren had asked, 3 messages up, whether the gift bags should be labeled by name or just handed out at the door. Diane's reply sat directly beneath it in plain black text, time-stamped 9 days earlier, the same day she'd called me about her blood pressure. Same as before. Nora's not ours yet. Her mother can handle her own. I read it twice, then a third time, in case reading it slower would change what it it said. I scrolled up. The thread went back months, further than I expected, and once I started, I couldn't make myself stop. Diane had written back in September that she thought Grant was moving too fast with someone who came with complications. She'd told Ren in October that she hoped the wedding would naturally lose momentum once the loan situation resolved, and Grant didn't feel obligated anymore. She'd used the word obligated, not the word love. Obligated, like I was a debt he was servicing rather than a person he'd chosen. I understood reading it that every slight I'd absorbed since March hadn't been carelessness. It had been strategy. Diane wasn't a woman who'd simply failed to warm up to a stepchild. She was a woman running a long, patient campaign to make sure that stepchild never had the chance to become permanent, using the loan as her leverage and time as her weapon, betting that if she made things unpleasant enough for long enough, I'd either leave on my own, or Grant would eventually choose the version of family that didn't require any adjustment from her. The shower shut off down the hall. I set the phone back exactly where I'd found it. Screen dimmed, and I didn't say a word to Grant when he came out. I told myself I needed to think first. What I actually needed was time to become the version of myself who could act on what I'd just learned, without falling apart in front of him. I called Owen the next morning from the parking lot outside the office, before I'd even taken my coat off. I need a cosigner release, I told him. Full removal from the note. Nothing partial, nothing that leaves my name attached to a single dollar of that loan. He pulled the file while I sat in my car with the heat running. I can get you out, he said, but she'll need to requalify on her own. Harder lender, higher rate, given her credit. You sure about this? I'm sure. While he worked the numbers, he ran a title search as a formality, standard procedure before drafting a release. That's how we found the second thing. In August, without telling either of us, Diane had taken out a personal loan of $6,000 against the equity in the fourplex, using the same refinanced mortgage as informal collateral through a private lender Ross Denny had referred her to, the same contractor she'd stiffed over the lien. She'd used part of it to pay off the lien itself, and the rest, based on the dates, had gone out around the same time as a family trip to Cedar Point that I remembered Diane mentioning, unprompted, at a dinner in September. She'd borrowed against a house my name was legally tied to, without my knowledge, to pay for a roller coaster trip for grandchildren who got gift bags my daughter didn't. I didn't tell Grant about any of it. Not the loan, not the text thread, not the release. For 2 weeks, I moved paperwork quietly behind everyone's back. A new appraisal came in higher than expected. Enough equity built up that Diane could requalify on her own with a harder lender and a rate 2 points above what we'd started with. Owen drafted the documents in Diane's name only, structured so that closing would happen without requiring her presence at a table with me, just a mobile notary and a stack of pages she'd sign the way she signed everything, without reading past the line marked with an X. On December 23rd, I signed the release. By the 24th, Diane was the sole borrower on all $86,000, refinanced under her name alone at a rate that would cost her an extra $91 a month for the life of the loan. My name was gone from the note entirely, gone from the property, gone from every document that had tied us together since May. I printed the confirmation letter that afternoon. I folded it into thirds. At the bottom, beneath the loan officer's signature block, I wrote 7 words by hand in blue ink. You should have let her in. Then I put it in my coat pocket and drove my daughter to Christmas Eve dinner. Cookies in her lap, a tin she'd decorated herself with a red ribbon she'd tied on with her tongue between her teeth in concentration. I gave Diane one more chance at that door, one gesture, one acknowledgement of my daughter's name, spoken like it mattered. She chose the porch light and folded arms instead. Behind her, Grant took one small step toward the door, then stopped. He looked at his shoes and said quietly, "Not tonight, please, not in front of everyone. Not tonight," like there would be a better night to defend his own daughter, some future date when the timing would finally line up. So I handed Diane the envelope and walked away smiling, because I already knew what was inside it, and what would happen the second she opened it. At 11:47 that night, my phone lit up. Diane's name, missed call, then another, then another. By the time I put Nora to bed, there were 26. When I woke up Christmas morning, there were 79, along with 4 voicemails I hadn't listened to yet, and a single text from Grant that just said, "Can we talk?" I made coffee first. I always make coffee first, no matter what. Grant showed up at 10 that morning without calling ahead, standing on my porch in the same coat he'd worn the night before, looking like he hadn't slept. Nora was in the living room in her pajamas, wrapping paper scattered around her, too absorbed in a new dinosaur set to notice him. "What did you do?" he asked, not angry yet, just lost. I didn't answer with words at first. I handed him my phone, the screenshots I'd taken of the group thread, saved in a folder I'd built the same careful way I'd built the house folder months earlier. He read them standing in my doorway, coat still on, and I watched his face do something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of collapsing that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "Nora's not ours yet," he read aloud, quiet, like the words tasted wrong in his mouth. "Her mother can handle her own." "She's been saying it for months," I said. "You were standing right there for some of it, and you never asked what she meant." "I didn't know," he said. "You didn't want to know," I said. "There's a difference, and I think you know that too." I told him about the release then, about paragraph 14, about Owen, about the $6,000 Diane had borrowed against a house that had my name on it, without telling either of us, spent in part on a roller coaster trip for children who got gift bags at the door my daughter got left outside of. He sat down at my kitchen table table and put his face in his hands for a long time. I let him. I didn't fill the silence with reassurance I didn't have yet to give. I should have said something at the door, he finally said. Any of the doors? All of them. Yes, I said. You should have. Diane called the family together on January 2nd, a Saturday, at the house on Denlinger Road, framing it to everyone as an emergency meeting about what Mara did to this family over Christmas. Ren called me the morning of, her voice tight, and told me she thought I should come, that she had something to say too, and that she'd rather say it in front of everyone than behind my back the way she'd let herself do for months. I brought the folder. Not the phone screenshots this time, printed pages, the same way I'd present evidence at the firm, dated and labeled, because I wanted Diane to understand exactly what kind of person she'd spent 8 months underestimating. The living room was full when I walked in with Grant. Ren already there, Hal and his wife, Diane standing near the fireplace, like she was presiding over a courtroom she assumed she controlled. I want everyone to hear this from me directly, Diane started, before I'd even taken my coat off. After everything I've done for this family, after I let this woman into my son's life, she went behind my back and sabotaged my finances out of pure spite. I released myself from a loan you were using to control your son's relationship, I said. That's not sabotage. That's a paralegal reading her own contract. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something true has just been said out loud for the first time. I set the printed pages on the coffee table, one by one. The text thread, dated and highlighted. The record of 6 missed and partial payments I'd covered from my own account, totaling $2,448, never mentioned to a single person in that room until now. The $6,000 private loan Diane had taken against equity that carried my name, used in part to fund a trip my daughter was never invited on. You told your daughter my daughter wasn't yours yet, I said, looking at Diane directly, my voice level, the voice I use in depositions when I need every word to land clean. You said it in writing. You made sure gift bags went to every grandchild in this family except the one whose mother was quietly keeping your house out of foreclosure. I want you to sit with that math for a minute because I have. Diane's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Defensiveness, then something closer to panic, as she realized the folder in front of her wasn't going to be argued away. You have no idea what it's like to lose your husband and your independence in the same 3 years, she said, her voice cracking toward the victim register she'd used with me on the phone weeks earlier. I know exactly what that costs, I said. I paid $2,448 of it without you ever once thanking me, and I watched you decide my 6-year-old wasn't worth a slice of birthday cake while you did it. I'm not the villain in the story where you finally have to answer for that. Ren spoke up then, quiet at first, then steadier. She's right, Mom. I felt sick about the gift bag thing for weeks. I should have said something sooner. I didn't, and that's on me too, but I'm not staying quiet anymore. Diane looked at her daughter like the floor had shifted under a house she'd assumed was structurally sound. I looked at Grant last. I need you to hear this part clearly, because I'm only going to say it once, I said. I will not build a family around a woman who has to be tricked or shamed into treating my daughter like she belongs. I don't need Diane to love Nora. I need her to stop pretending Nora's absence at that door was an accident, and I need you to stop letting silence do your talking for you. Diane turned to Hal, who'd been standing near the kitchen doorway trying to look like furniture. Hal, tell them this is ridiculous. Tell them how hard I've worked to hold this family together. Hal shifted his weight, clearly wishing he'd stayed home. I mean, he said slowly, Josie did ask me once why Nora never comes to stuff. I didn't really have an answer for her, Aunt Diane. I probably should have asked you about it myself. It wasn't a dramatic betrayal, not the kind that makes for a satisfying story on its own, just a nephew failing to lie convincingly on command, but I watched something in Diane's posture give a little, when even her most reliably neutral relative wouldn't back her without qualification. This is exactly the kind of pile-on I expected, Diane said, her voice climbing towards something brittle. One mistake taken out of context, and suddenly I'm a monster in my own living room. It wasn't one mistake, I said. It was 8 months of choices, repeated in front of witnesses that all pointed the same direction. I have the dates if you'd like to review them again. She didn't ask to review them again. She sat down instead, on the arm of the sofa nearest the fireplace, and for a moment she looked less like the woman who'd blocked a doorway in the snow, and more like exactly what she was, 61 years old, caught, with no more excuses left in the drawer. I never meant for it to feel like that to her, Diane finally said, quieter than anything else she'd said all afternoon. It was the closest thing to an admission I ever got out of her, and even then it arrived wrapped in a passive construction that let her stand slightly outside her own actions, as though the feeling had simply happened to Nora, independent of anything Diane herself had chosen to do. Intention isn't really the part I need you to understand, I said. The part I need you to understand is that she noticed. She's 6, and she noticed months before I let myself admit what she was noticing. Children always know before the adults around them are willing to say it out loud. Grant didn't defend his mother. For the first time in 8 months, he didn't. The weeks after New Year's split the family down a seam that had probably always been there, just never pulled taut enough to show. Hal and his wife stayed carefully neutral, the way people do when they'd rather not choose a side that might cost them access to holidays. They still send a card. It still doesn't mention Nora by name, though I've stopped expecting it to. Ren became something I hadn't planned for, an actual ally instead instead of a cautious bystander. She started including Nora deliberately in things after that, texting me directly to ask about her shoe size before birthdays, showing up to her school's winter concert in February with a small stuffed Parasaurolophus that made my daughter shriek with a joy I hadn't seen aimed at that side of the family in almost a year. I should have said something a long time before I did, Ren told me over coffee that spring. I kept telling myself it wasn't my fight. It was never not my fight. I just didn't want it to be. The most unexpected ally came from a direction I hadn't considered at all. Diane had a sister, Carol, who lived in Springfield and rarely came to family events. Carol reached out to me in late January, unprompted, after hearing a secondhand version of the New Year's meeting from Ren. I need you to know this isn't new, Carol told me on the phone, her voice careful, like she'd rehearsed the words before dialing. Walter had a daughter from his first marriage, Renee. Diane did something very similar to her 30 years ago, when Renee was about the same age as your Nora. Different house, same door, more or less. Renee stopped coming around by the time she was a teenager. Nobody in the family ever really talks about her. I hadn't known Grant had a half-sister. He hadn't known the full shape of it either, not until I told him what Carol had said, and watching him absorb that his mother had run this exact pattern once before, successfully enough that an entire branch of the family had simply been allowed to fall away and go quiet, did something to him that the group text alone hadn't managed. It made the betrayal ancestral instead of situational. It meant Diane hadn't slipped once, under pressure. She had a method, refined over decades, and I had simply been the first person in a long time to read the fine print before signing onto it. Diane's desperate moves started small and got less dignified as the winter wore on. She called Owen's office directly in January, trying to argue the release was invalid, that she'd been confused when she signed it, that a woman her age couldn't be expected to understand complex legal documents. Owen, who has seen every version of this argument in 15 years of practice, sent back a polite letter citing the notarized signature, the witnessed closing, and the fact that Diane had run a rental property on her own for 11 years before any of this started. The argument went nowhere. It was never going to. She reached out to mutual friends next, an old church acquaintance who still followed me on Facebook, painting a version of events where I'd manipulated a grieving widow out of financial security, out of jealousy over her son's attention. The story didn't hold up well against dated bank transfers and screenshots, and it mostly just cost her the sympathy of people who'd known her only casually before, and now knew her better than she wanted. By March, the higher interest rate on her solo refinance had eaten into whatever cushion she'd had left. The fourplex still needed a new furnace in one unit and a full kitchen renovation in another before it could command real rent, and without a second income backing the note, Diane couldn't qualify for the improvement loan she needed to make those repairs. In April, she listed one of the 4 units for sale as a standalone condo conversion, a move Owen told me was legally messy and would likely take a year to untangle through the county. As far as I know, it still hasn't sold. Grant moved out of the apartment we'd been slowly merging our lives toward and took a month in an extended stay hotel off I-6, 7, and 5, which felt at the time like the end of something I'd built a future around. We didn't talk every day. When we did, the conversations were careful, stripped of the easy affection we'd had before, replaced by something more like two people renegotiating terms they'd assumed were settled. I grieved during that month in a way I hadn't expected to. Not for Diane exactly, though there was some of that too. Some version of the grandmother I'd hoped she'd become for Nora, the one who'd have taught her to garden or told her stories about Walter, the one who existed only in the version of this family I'd imagined back in April at John Bryan State Park. I grieved the Christmas mornings that could have happened instead of the one that did. I grieved a future where my daughter had more people who showed up for her, not fewer. One night in late February, Nora asked me out of nowhere, while I was braiding her hair before bed, "Is Grandma Diane still my grandma, even though she doesn't like me?" I set the brush down. "You don't need someone to like you for you to be someone worth liking," I told her. "That was never about you, baby. That was about a decision she made a long time before you were even born. You don't have to carry it." She thought about that for a second, the way 6-year-olds do, weighing something too big for the space it was given. "Okay," she said, and went back to asking about the Parasaurolophus's diet, which felt, in its own small way, like the most honest form of healing I could have hoped for. Grant came back in March, not with grand declarations, but with small, consistent things. He started attending Nora's school events without me having to ask. He set a boundary with Diane directly for the first time in his life, telling her that any relationship with him going forward required an actual apology to Nora, spoken to her directly, not filtered through gift bags or holiday cards trying to paper over what had happened. Diane never gave that apology, not that spring, not by summer. She sent a card in April, generic, store-bought, addressed to the family, which Grant returned unopened with a short note of his own, the kind of gesture that would have seemed cruel to me 8 months earlier, and now just felt like the natural conclusion to everything that had come before it. He called her once more that April, a conversation he told me about afterward, almost word for word, sitting on our back steps with a beer he didn't drink much of. "I told her the door works both ways now," he said. "I told her I'd help her move a couch or drive her to an appointment if she ever needed it, because she's still my mother, and I'm not going to pretend that stops mattering to me. But I told her Nora doesn't owe her a relationship she never earned, and neither do I. Not anymore. Not until she can say Nora's name in front of people without flinching like like it costs her something. What did she say? I asked. She said I sounded just like my father, Grant said. And for once, he didn't seem to mean it as an insult passed down secondhand. I think for the first time she meant that as an accusation, and I got to hear it as a compliment instead. We set a wedding date in June for the following September, a full year out from the night at the door. Diane was not on the guest list. Ren was. I hadn't planned to reach out to Renee. Carol gave me her number in February, almost as an afterthought, saying only that Renee lived in Columbus now and worked as a school counselor, and that she doubted Renee would want to hear from a stranger dredging up 30-year-old wounds. I sat on the number for 6 weeks before I used it. I finally texted her in late March, short and plain, telling her who I was and why I was reaching out, half expecting silence in return. She wrote back within an hour. We met for coffee at a place near her office 2 weeks later, and she was warmer than I had any right to expect from someone I'd essentially cold contacted about her own childhood trauma. I used to think it was something wrong with me, Renee told me, turning her cup slowly on the table between us. I was 8 the first time she left me out of a family photo on purpose. I spent 20 years thinking I must have done something to deserve it, before I finally understood it was never about me at all. That's almost word for word what I told my daughter, I said. Good, Renee said. Tell her early. It took me until I was 34 to believe it about myself. We stayed in touch after that. Renee came to Nora's 7th birthday party in May, bringing a book about dinosaurs that turned out to be exactly the one Nora had been asking the library for. And watching the two of them, technically family, technically strangers until 4 months earlier, sit together on my living room floor sounding out the names of the Cretaceous period, I understood something about Diane that I hadn't fully let myself see before. She hadn't just cost herself a granddaughter. She'd cost an entire branch of her own family the chance to know each other, generation after generation, over a decision about who counted and who didn't that she'd made and remade at every door she'd ever stood behind. Diane made one more real attempt that spring, and it was the one that finally closed something in Grant that had stayed stubbornly open until then. In April, without telling anyone, she showed up at Nora's elementary school on Grandparents' Day, a morning event the school held every year for students to bring an older relative in to share a story or a skill. Nora hadn't invited her. Nora, in fact, had asked my mother to come instead, and my mother had already RSVP'd through the school portal weeks earlier. But Diane arrived at the front office claiming to be Nora's grandmother, and because the school had no reason to doubt a woman who shared Grant's last name, they let her sign in and walk toward the classroom before anyone thought to check. I got the call from Nora's teacher, Mrs. Aldous, a little after 9 that morning, her voice careful and apologetic, explaining that there seemed to be some confusion about which grandmother was expected. I called Grant from the parking lot, already moving. He beat me there by 4 minutes, having left a job site an hour early the second I texted him. By the time I reached the classroom, Grant was already crouched at Nora's desk, speaking low and even, while Diane stood near the door with the frozen, brittle smile of someone who'd badly miscalculated a room's sympathies. My mother had arrived on time and was seated exactly where she belonged, in the chair beside Nora, and the two of them had been in the middle of a story about growing tomatoes when Diane walked in uninvited and tried to insert herself into a morning that had never had a place set for her. You need to leave, Grant told his mother, quiet enough not to disrupt the other families, firm enough that there was no mistaking it for a request. She didn't invite you. You don't get to override that because you want a version of this morning you didn't earn. Diane left without a scene, though her face on the way out told me everything about how she'd narrate that morning to anyone who'd listen later. I heard secondhand that the story that circulated afterward involved Grant humiliating his own mother in front of a room full of strangers. I've stopped correcting the versions of the story that reach me secondhand. The people who matter already know which version is true. The legal complications from the fourplex kept surfacing through the spring and into summer. Ross Denny, the contractor Diane had stiffed the year before, filed a small claims suit in May over the interest he claimed still accrued on the disputed roofing bill, a claim that dragged through Montgomery County Court until August, when a magistrate ruled Diane owed him an additional $1,100 on top of what she'd already paid through the personal loan. The condo conversion she'd attempted on one unit stalled in the county zoning office for months over a setback variance nobody had warned her she'd need, and by the time she finally sold the unit that November, the fourplex was down to 3 occupied units and a mortgage payment that ate most of what those 3 brought in. None of it was catastrophic. It was just erosion, slow and self-inflicted, the natural consequence of a decade of managing a property the way she'd managed a family, on charm and improvisation instead of anything built to hold weight. Grant and I started seeing a counselor in April, a woman named Dr. Palmer with an office in Beaver Creek, mostly because I told him I couldn't build a marriage on top of a habit of silence, and he agreed, faster than I expected, that he didn't want to either. We spent most sessions on smaller, more ordinary things by summer, the way most couples do once the crisis that brought them in has stopped being the only thing in the room. But we spent the first several sessions entirely on the 8 months between April and December, on every door where he'd said, "Not tonight," instead of standing beside me, and on what it would take for him to trust his own voice the next time someone he loved needed him to use it. I kept thinking loyalty to her and loyalty to you were the same kind of thing, he told me in one of those early sessions, like I could ration it and it it would come out even. I didn't understand that some situations don't let you split the difference. You either show up or you don't. You show up now, I said. That's the part I'm choosing to build on. My own parents found out about all of it later than I would have liked, mostly because I hadn't wanted to worry them while I was still moving pieces quietly behind the scenes in December. My mother, when I finally told her the whole thing in January, sat at my kitchen table for a long moment before she said anything at all. You should have called me the second you saw that text, she said. Not for permission, just so somebody else was carrying it with you. She wasn't wrong. I'd spent so many years being the person who handled things alone, first as a single mother, then as a paralegal trained to solve problems without waiting for anyone's blessing, that it hadn't occurred to me there might have been comfort available in the space between discovering something and acting on it. My father, quieter about most things, simply asked what Diane's number was, and whether I wanted him to call her himself. I told him no. I told him I'd already handled it in the only language Diane had ever seemed to respect, the language of paperwork and consequences instead of confrontation and pleading, and he nodded like that made sense to him, which, coming from a man who'd spent 30 years as an insurance adjuster, it probably did. Grant and I started house hunting that spring, partly out of practical need, since the apartment he'd been renting had never really been built for 3 people, and partly, I think, because we both wanted a place that didn't carry any residue of that year on its walls. We looked at 11 houses between March and June, most of them within a few miles of Nora's school, before we found a 3-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac in Beaver Creek, with a covered front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a doorbell that Nora insisted on testing 4 separate times during the walkthrough. I like this door, she announced solemnly, standing in the entryway, and Grant and I looked at each other over her head and both understood, without saying it out loud, exactly what she meant and why it mattered more than square footage or the granite countertops the listing had bragged about. We closed on the house in July. The first thing Grant did, before we'd even unpacked a single box, was install a small brass plaque beside the door, the kind you'd normally see with a house number or a family name engraved on it. Instead, it read, in simple block letters, "Everyone welcome." It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Nora asked what it meant, and Grant told her it meant that from now on, in this house, nobody was ever going to stand outside in the cold, while people she loved celebrated without her. She hugged the doorframe like it was a person before she hugged either of us. Thanksgiving that year fell 9 days before the fourplex's 3rd unit finally sold, and we hosted it ourselves for the first time, at our place, instead of Denlinger Road. Wren came with a pumpkin pie and her husband Derek, who I'd met maybe 4 times total before that year, and who spent most of the afternoon on the floor helping Nora build a dinosaur diorama out of a shoebox. Carol drove up from Springfield. Renee came too, bringing a green bean casserole and an easy laugh that filled the kitchen in a way I hadn't expected from someone I'd known less than a year. My mother sat at the head of the table, the way she always did wherever we hosted, and at one point during dinner, she looked around at the mismatched chairs we'd pulled from 3 different rooms to fit everyone and said, "This is a strange collection of people." Not unkindly, more like she was working out the math of how we'd all ended up in the same room. "It's the collection that showed up," I told her, and Grant reached over and squeezed my hand under the table the same way he had that November night over pot roast, except this time the gesture didn't feel like an apology standing in for a spine. It felt like agreement. Diane wasn't there. Nobody brought her up until Nora, unprompted midway through pie, asked whether Grandma Diane was having a nice Thanksgiving somewhere else. Grant answered before I could, calm and unhurried in a way that would have surprised the version of him from a year earlier. "I don't know, Bug," he said, "but we're having a good one right here, and that's the one I get to think about today." Nora seemed satisfied with that. She went back to arranging her diorama's plastic ferns and didn't ask again. I heard from Diane exactly twice more that year, both times through Wren, since she and I had stopped speaking directly sometime around March. The first was a message relayed in June, asking whether I'd consider letting her attend the wedding, just to watch from the back, no speaking role. I declined, not out of cruelty, but because I understood by then that Diane's requests were never really about the thing she was asking for. They were about testing whether a door she'd once controlled might still open partway if she asked softly enough. I'd learned to stop answering that particular test. The second message came in August, a single line passed along through Wren. "Tell her I hope the wedding is everything she wants." I never found out whether Diane meant it kindly or as one last quiet dig about who exactly had built the day she wasn't invited to attend. I decided, in the end, it didn't matter which. I'd stopped needing her intentions to be good in order to move forward without her. We got married on the 2nd Saturday in September, a full year and change after the night Diane left my daughter standing in the snow. The ceremony was small, 40 guests, held outdoors at a restored barn venue in Yellow Springs, close enough to the lake house that had once had no room for us, that I noticed the irony and let myself smile about it instead of letting it sting. Nora was the flower girl. She'd asked weeks earlier if she could also do a reading, something she'd apparently been planning without telling me, and when I asked her what she wanted to read, she said she'd written it herself. I let her. I've learned over the past year to trust what my daughter decides she needs to say out loud. She stood at the small wooden podium in a dress the color of the ones she'd worn the Christmas before, though nobody but me seemed to notice that detail, and read from a piece of notebook paper folded into quarters, her voice clear in the way children's voices are clear when they haven't yet learned to perform sincerity instead of simply having it. "My mom says family is the people who who open the door, she read. Not the people who make you wait outside. I'm glad I got a dad who opens doors now too. There wasn't a dry eye among the 40 people in those folding chairs, and Grant, standing at the front in a suit I'd watched him iron himself 3 times that morning out of nervous energy, had to press the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment before he could compose himself enough to take my hand when I reached him. Ren stood up during the toasts, unplanned as far as I knew, and said that she'd learned more about what family was supposed to look like from watching me build one from scratch than she had from 30 years inside the one she was born into. Renee came too, seated near the back with Carol, and caught my eye at one point during the reception with a look that needed no words attached to it, the look of 2 people who'd found each other because of the same woman's failure and decided to build something better out of the wreckage of it. Diane wasn't there. I'd meant what I told Ren back in June. I hadn't closed the door out of spite. I'd simply stopped being willing to leave it open for someone who'd spent a year proving, patiently and repeatedly, exactly what she'd do with it if I did. I think about that Christmas Eve often, more than I expected to a year out. Not with the raw heat I carried in December, but with something steadier, the particular clarity that comes after you've had enough distance to see a moment clean. I think about the porch light, orange against the snow. I think about the cookie tin sitting forgotten on the railing, stickers curling slightly at the edges from the cold. I think about my daughter's small, steady voice asking why her grandmother didn't like her, and how much I wish, even now, that I'd never had to answer that question honestly. I don't regret the envelope. I don't regret the 7 words I wrote by hand at the bottom of a loan release document, though I understand now they were as much for me as they ever were for Diane. You should have let her in. I meant it about the door on Denlinger Road. I meant it too. About every door before that one. Every small chance Diane had across 8 months to choose my daughter, and chose instead to protect a version of family that had no room for the child who didn't share her blood. What I've learned, in the year since, is that you don't need everyone to love your child in order to build her a life full of people who do. Nora has a father who learned, late but for good, to use his voice instead of his silence. She has an aunt who shows up now with the wrong shoe size and asks instead of assuming. She has a great aunt in Springfield and a woman named Renee who understands, better than anyone else alive, exactly what it costs to grow up on the wrong side of a closed door, and who has made it her business ever since to make sure Nora never learns that particular lesson the same way. What she doesn't have, and probably never will now, is a grandmother who chose her back. That's the part I still let myself grieve quietly on nights when the wedding photos catch my eye on the mantle, and I notice, the way I always will, that one chair in the family photo that stayed empty because a woman decided, over and over, at every opportunity, that a 6-year-old in a red dress simply wasn't worth the trouble of opening a door for. I hand my leverage out quietly now, the way I always have. I don't raise my voice. I don't need to. I learned a long time before that Christmas Eve that the people who do the most damage rarely respect anything except the paperwork. And I've built a life since then on making sure the paperwork always says exactly what I mean it to say. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the full story, whether I regret waiting so long to act, whether I should have said something the first time Diane set a paper towel down instead of a plate. I used to think the answer was yes. I've come around slowly to a different one. I needed those months, every slighted plate and every skipped photo, not because I was too weak to act sooner, but because I needed a record complete enough that no one, not Grant, not the family, not even Diane herself standing in her own living room, could later claim it had all been one misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by an oversensitive woman protecting her kid. I built the case the same way I build every case, patiently, with dates attached, so that when I finally opened my mouth, there would be nothing left for anyone to argue with. Some nights when Nora's asleep and the house is finally quiet, I think about the version of this story where Diane opens the door instead of blocking it, where she looks at my daughter in her red dress and sees a grandchild instead of a complication. I let myself sit with that version for a minute or two, the ache of a family that could have existed and didn't, and then I close it the way I've learned to close most things that no longer serve the people I've chosen to protect. Then I go check on my daughter, asleep in a room in a house where every door, every single one, opens for her without hesitation, and I remember that I gave her that, quietly, on purpose, one envelope at a time.